me for my voice, but I have never seen anything like it.
Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, as always, Andrew Zimmel. Jam-packed day to day for the podcast page. If you just are tuning into this page, put out content daily. Today, big day, though, for the content. 5 podcasts out today, breaking down TV shows we're watching during quarantine that you guys should be checking out as well. And, of course, a little bit of sports to go with it. So today we're talking about numbers 67 through 53 on the 2000 all-time list. Just to reiterate, to remind you guys at home what it took to make the list, you had to make one All-Star game during the 2000s to make the list. I figured, the best players make the All-Star game normally. If you play a decade, you play 10 years, you're going to make one All-Star game if you are worth your salt. So that is where we start. We start with a guy who made one All-Star game this decade. We're looking at you, Jerry Stackhouse. So Stackhouse, of course, had a pretty solid decade, 10 seasons. You're going to remember most from the Dallas Mavericks. 17 points per game, 3.6 assists, 3 rebounds. VORP of 12.6. We talked a little bit about the value of replacement. He's about middle of the road, middle of the pack in this group when you look at it. Makes that one final trip with the Mavericks in 2006. His playoff numbers are pretty solid, 13.6 points per game, a couple assists, a couple rebounds. Let's talk about Stackhouse's best season this decade. Jerry Stackhouse, you're going to remember, starting the beginning of the decade with some subpar teams, the early Detroit Pistons before they became the bad boy Pistons of the 2000s. He moves over to Dallas in free agency in the 2004 offseason. His best season, of course, was that first season with Dallas where he scored 14.9 points per game. As a shooting guard, he played an okay role. On that 2006 team, played 55 games. Only started in 11 of them, though, coming off the bench. I think that he makes the all-time Mavericks team. I was kind of kickballing this around with some of my friends recently, and I was saying, hey, if Stack, does he make it? Is he worth his salt? 27 minutes per game, about 13 points off the bench. I think he does. Now, granted, the best years of his career come in that first part of it, the first part of his career. He makes those 2 All-Star games with Detroit. Is he one of the best players in this decade? Yeah, I think so. And he barely slips ahead of some of the other guys that we did on Monday because, and here's the big because he played the 10 seasons. That's a big reason for it. But also because he was on that really good Mavericks team. Now, he's partially to blame, too. If you're going to take the credit, you got to take the blame. He's partially to blame, too, for the Mavericks' loss in 2007. Now, he didn't play a ton of games that season. Only started in 8, played 67 games. Got them to the 1 seed. But you have to also remember, Stackhouse at this point of his career is 32. He's on his way out. After the 2010 season, he doesn't start. Well, he starts 1 game in the 2012-13 season. So, Basketball Reference, kind to Stackhouse. 2-time All-Star, made the All-Rookie team in the past decade, in the 90s. So that stat doesn't drag over to the 2000s, but still pretty good on this list. At number 66, Vlade Divac. He only plays 5 seasons in this decade. He makes an All-Star game, makes an appearance, same way with Stack. The problem with Vlade is that he plays his best basketball in the very beginning of the decade and then trails off very quickly. Now, he was probably the 4th or 5th most important player on that Kings team that pushed the Lakers to 7 games. That said, he is a staple in basketball history. Not only being a European player, not only being a guy who really made the NBA global. I think people forget, you don't need to be Giannis Antetokounmpo, you don't need to be a Manu Ginobili or Tony Parker to have international influence. The fact that you got guys from all over the globe coming to the United States playing NBA basketball is just a point in itself. It makes the game global. A guy like Vlade Divac did a lot for NBA Cares, did a lot for the NBA community. He's a staple in this game. If you talk to anybody around basketball, are people all going to hands down say, oh, Vlade, all-time great player? No. And I don't expect them to. But In the 2000s, he plays a very crucial role on that Kings team that was competing with the Lakers. He's got a legacy point right there for that. 10.4 points per game, 7 assists per game, or 7 rebounds per game. I'm sorry. His win share is 27.1. One of the, again, middle of the road type of guys in this decade. His value over replacement though is 10. Should he be higher than Stackhouse? Yeah, and here's why. Averaging 10.8 and 7 in the playoffs is what puts him ahead. And he was a starter. So he barely edged out Stackhouse. Also, you got to remember, too, Vlade Divac, not so much for his play in the 2000s, but he is a Hall of Famer. Moving on to 65, another Hall of Famer, Grant Hill, played 9 seasons in this decade. You remember him from his time with the Detroit Pistons, also with the Phoenix Suns. Now, he kind of held the Suns back. Hot take, get it? Because he played for the Suns. Hot take is that he is part of the reason why that Suns team never won a title. Because he was slower. And I think that the problem with the Phoenix Suns is instead of leaning into the pace and space, instead of leaning into all the really cool stuff that Steve Kerr and Mike D'Antoni wanted to do with that team, for some reason, they decided to slow it down. They got guys like Shaq, got guys like Grant Hill, put them in the mix. It didn't work out. But the beginning of this decade was incredible for the former Orlando Magic player. You got to remember, he makes the All-Star game in the 2000-2001 season, only playing 4 games. He, again, only plays 14 games, 29 games. He got hampered by injury early in the decade. That first season where he actually is a standout player, the 04-05 season, he averages 19.7 points per game. That was the highest points per game he averaged since his time in Detroit. He goes on to Phoenix to end the decade. He plays 82 games in the 08-09 season. Of course, another one of those seasons where they were the Phoenix Suns 2 pieces away from being a real title contender, or actually winning a title, honestly. So where do we put Grant Hill on this list? Well, like I mentioned, we put him at 65, mostly because of the numbers. He played 9 seasons, 14.1 points per game, 2.8 assists, 5 rebounds. What was supposed to be the next Michael Jordan just never really panned out. You hate to see it. Injuries really hampered this guy. Another guy on this list that got hampered by injuries is Tracy McGrady. But McGrady, of course, much better player, I think, in this decade than Grant Hill. So, moving on to number 64. 9 seasons in the decade as well. 13 points per game, 6 rebounds. A weird player when I was looking at some of his numbers. Because if you remember him just from the 2010s, his numbers and his name are almost infamous at this point. I'm talking about Gerald Wallace. Gerald Wallace makes an all-star game in that 2009-2010 season, so he barely makes it the cutoff. His best season, I would argue, was that 07-08 season. He played 62 games, 19.4 points per game. His MVP, or his all-star game season, I should say, 18 points per game, averaging just a little bit over 2 assists and 10 rebounds. Double-double he averaged that year for the Charlotte Hornets. He then, of course, goes to Portland, and then gets bounced to Brooklyn, is a member of that infamous Celtics trade. That's going to be the legacy that I think Gerald Wallace has. But while he played in this decade, he makes an all-star game, 13 points per game, 6 assists, or 6 rebounds, I should say, 55.6 points per shooting percentage from the floor. I'm sorry, man. Long day, we should say, on the podcast, so we're trying to keep it together. Pretty solid seasons in the decade, 9 seasons in the decade. Never made an all-star, made one all-star game. His playoff numbers, pretty poo-poo, 4.6 points, a couple rebounds. So, Gerald Wallace, 64. Number 62, Glenn Robinson. Another guy, legend from the 90s. He makes one NBA championship game with the San Antonio Spurs. He wins that title with the Spurs, makes one all-star game in the decade. Another career kind of cut short by injuries. He gets bounced around at the end of his career, Atlanta, Philadelphia, ends up in San Antonio, wins that title with the Spurs. His MVP or his All-Star Games seasons, the 99, 2000, 2001 seasons, he averaged 21.4 points per game, 6 rebounds, about 3 assists. Solid player, NBA champion. The NBA championship really is the thing that separates him from the rest of them. And that's really what puts him a little bit ahead of the rest of the guys on the list. Moving on to number 62, NBA champion. You remember him more for his time before he was a champion. He got bounced around a little bit, goes to Miami, has a little bit of a heart issue. Hall of Famer, 7 seasons in the decade, wins the title in 2006 with the Miami Heat. One of the Heat's greatest all-time players. His numbers retired in the stadium. It's Alonzo Mourning. Now, the reason Alonzo Mourning at 62 is further down than, say, a guy like Dikembe Mutombo or David Robinson is because, if we're being completely honest, his impact in the decade was not nearly as great as both of those guys. Even though Robinson played 4 fewer seasons than Alonzo Mourning in the decade, even though Mutombo played only 2 seasons more, both those guys I thought more impactful in the decade than Alonzo Mourning. Alonzo Mourning, 62, 10 points per game, half a assist, almost 6 rebounds per game, 59% from the floor. His win share, again, another guy, pretty average for this group, 19.3, value over replacement, 4.1. He was a role player on that team that won the title. He is going to be more remembered being a 90s superstar than he was a 2000s hero. But rarely is there a team like that 2000 Miami Heat team that is full of guys who are just trying to get that ring, who are older guys, who are guys who are on their last contract, who are just really trying to get over the hump and kind of riding on the coattails of guys like Shaquille O'Neal and Dwayne Wade. What's interesting to me is that there wasn't a team like that until a few years later when the Dallas Mavericks won their title. And they had guys like Dirk Nowitzki, Jason Kidd, Jason Terry, who all were looking for their first ring as well. And that group of players, they win their first one. It means something a little bit more. A similar team, I would say, to that 2006 Miami team would be last year's Raptors team that won the title, that they finally got the monkey off their back. They were able to win a chip. The Heat, people forget, the Heat before Dwayne Wade got there, kind of up and down franchise. Kind of an up and down franchise. Dwayne Wade comes in, re-energizes, rejuvenates. They trade for Shaquille O'Neal. That clicks immediately. They almost go to the NBA Finals in 2005. 2006 to get the job done. Alonzo Mourning gets his ring. Number 62 on the list. At number 61, guy who played in multiple decades, was a NBA champion at the beginning of his career and at the end of his career. It's Sam Cassell. Sam Cassell won championship appearance this decade, won title this decade, won All-Star Game appearance this decade. 16.9 points per game, 6 assists, 3.5 rebounds. You look at his playoff numbers, a guy who kind of showed up in the playoffs, to be being completely honest with you. 13.6 points, 4 assists, and 2.5 rebounds. Sam Cassell, interesting player, because you remember his first title comes with the Houston Rockets on one of their great teams of the 90s. His second title comes with his second run at the title, I should say, comes with the Boston Celtics at the end of the decade. He retires a champion in 2008 after playing a few seasons with the Los Angeles Clippers. He makes the All-Star game, though, his lone All-Star game appearance in the 03-04 season, where he averaged almost 20 points per game and 7 assists. Of course, you remember that season for Kevin Garnett, who was playing on the same team as him, the Minnesota Timberwolves, where Garnett has an incredible season, winning the MVP award that year. Sam Cassell, number 61 on the list. Honestly, thought he should have gotten a little bit more recognition for what he did. 2-time champion, champion this decade. Maybe I should have had him a little bit higher. His value over replacement, though, not great at 13.6, so a little bit higher than some of the other guys in this group, but at the same time, a role player nevertheless. At number 60 on the list, it's Mehmet Okur, who makes one All-Star Game appearance, wins the title with the Bad Boy Pistons in 2004, 8 seasons in the decade, almost 14 points per game, 7 rebounds per game, 56% true shooting percentage, value over replacement 14.8. Of course, all those numbers matter. But again, another guy who is a role player coming off the bench to win the title for the Detroit Pistons. That's why he is claimed fame as the Pistons. His All-Star game, however, came in the 06-07 seasons with the Utah Jazz, where he averaged 17.6 points for the season, 7 rebounds, played all 80 games. The season before he played 82. Another real solid role player, another real solid guy that you kind of want on your team. Winning the title on that 04 team when he was only in his second season, coming off the bench in 33 games, made 71 appearances. Starting in 33 games, playing in 71 games. Coming in, being a solid, decent role player early in his career, and then being able to go to an All-Star game later in his career, I think that matters a little bit, not only to me, but I think to fans of Okur. Going on to number 59 on the list, Antonio Walker, who you remember as a Boston Celtic, but he, again, another one of those players from that championship team in Miami that was able to win the title. He averaged 12 points per game and 5 rebounds on that team, playing in all 82 games, but starting in 19 of them. He was a good role player on those teams. He makes 2 All-Star games, though, early in his career in Boston, playing next to Paul Pierce, averaging 22 and 20 points per game in that 2 seasons he makes the All-Star game. Good dunker, solid guy. One of the rare players who almost made 3 of the all-decade lists. He comes in at 96, 97. He has a solid career in the 2000s, playing in 8 of the 10 possible seasons in this decade, averaging one of the most in his group of players. Remember, when you're going through 67 through 53, averaging one of the most for his group of players at 16 points per game. One of the better Celtics of all time. We wish that he was still on the team when they won the title in 07-08, because if he was, he could have been an impact player. It's just a shame that he couldn't have won that ring in Boston. I think that would have meant a lot. But I digress. Moving on to 58, Michael Finley. 10 seasons. He wins the title with the San Antonio Spurs in that 07 season. He goes to 2 possible championship games, however, because he also played for the Dallas Mavericks early in his career, too. So let's talk about it. So he goes to 2 All-Star games early in his career, the 99-2000 season, 2000-2001 season, where he averaged 22 points per game, about 6 rebounds, 5 assists, solid 3-point shooter as well. When you look at his numbers, 40 and 34% in those 2 All-Star game seasons. He goes to the NBA Finals with the San Antonio Spurs in 07. And then, again, he goes to the finals. I'm sorry, I misspoke when I said he went to the finals with the Dallas Mavericks. He went with the Spurs in 07, won the title, and then he went again in 2010 with the Boston Celtics when he got traded from San Antonio to Boston. So, Michael Finley, great sharpshooter. Was not. I don't think anybody was very pivotal in that 07 championship game with the Spurs winning. But to say that he wasn't impactful, I think would be taking away from him. He played in all 82 games that season, started in 16 of them. Good role player for the Spurs. Again, another guy who's going to be remembered more for his role playing than I think for being an all-star. Another guy, though, ironically enough, might put him on the Mavs all-time team just because of the longevity of his career and just because of what he was able to do with the Mavericks. The Mavericks being a struggling franchise early on. You got to remember that he starts his career in Phoenix, gets traded to Dallas, and then is a real staple for that team as they make playoff appearance after playoff appearance after playoff appearance. So I like what they did. I'm going with him at 58. At 57 is Sharif Ador Rahim, who played the majority of his career in the 2000s. He makes that all-star game with the Atlanta Hawks, averaging 21 and 9 rebounds, 3 assists for that Atlanta Hawks team. Of course, he gets traded to Portland later on and then ends his career with the Kings. Not a whole lot to say for him. Makes 1 all-star game appearance Makes an all-rookie team early in his career, playing for Vancouver. Another guy, kind of forgettable, but his numbers, 9 seasons in the decade, averaging 17-7 for the decade, 17 VORP, one of the highest, I think the highest win share, though, of any player in this group at 56.8. So he's on winning teams. He contributed to winning teams. One All-Star Game appearance in the playoffs, though. Didn't average double digits, 9 and 4 in the playoffs. At number 56, it's Michael Redd. Redd, known as Silky, according to his Basketball Reference. I don't know how much I believe in that, but majority of his career played with the Milwaukee Bucks, where he averaged 20 and 4. Good scorer. Never really did a ton individually. When we talk about individual accolades, makes one All-Star Game appearance in the playoffs, 17, almost 18 and 5 in the playoffs at 56. At 55, it's Karl Malone. Karl Malone, another guy, makes the All-Star Game in a really weird way. So he makes the All-Star Game in that early in the decade with the Utah Jazz. So he makes 2 All-Star Game appearances with the Utah Jazz when his career is really falling apart. So he averages for Utah in the 2000s 22 and 8. Then he goes and makes that one finals appearance this decade with the Los Angeles Lakers, who you'll remember were really falling apart at the seams. It was the last year that Shaq and Kobe played together. Gary Payton was on that team. It was just a weird mix of players, really weird chemistry. Malone gets hurt. That kind of ends his career. Well, it does end his career at 40. But I will say, I will give Malone credit for this, that in the playoffs, in the decade, he averaged a respectable 16 and 8. This is coming off multiple NBA Finals appearances. This is coming after, honestly, I thought that he had one of the best cases for best power forward of all time. He wins an MVP. He goes to 2 finals games. And all of a sudden, this guy, Tim Duncan, comes on the scene and just blows everybody away. You'd like to say that he would be a little bit higher on the list. But again, he only plays 4 seasons. But all 4 of those seasons, I still think, are more respectable than guys like Alonzo Mourning. And honestly, a ton more respectable than Michael Jordan's career in the 2000s. So, Karl Malone, 55 on the list. At 54, it's David West. David West makes those All-Star games with the New Orleans Hornets. Later becomes the New Orleans Hornets. He was on those teams that played in Oklahoma City. He makes back-to-back All-Star games in 07 and 08, where he averages 21-ish and 9 as a big man for those teams. With Chris Paul as your point guard, you're going to get good looks at the basket. He is the closest thing we've had to John Stockton mixed with Magic Johnson, I think. And that's not taking anything away from those guys. That's talking great about Chris Paul. Like, I think Chris Paul is one of the best playmakers of all time. He really can get his guys in positions to score the basketball. David West playing with Chris, I think, really enhanced and really helped his career. And playing those 2 seasons with him really did some impact. And then, of course, you remember him winning the titles with the Golden State Warriors at the very end of his career. He ended his career with, I want to say, 2 titles. Yeah, 2-time NBA champion. But those years in New Orleans, I think he made a big impact on that city. It's a shame that he didn't go to more All-Star games, because I thought his best years came with the Indiana Pacers later in his time. At number 53, this guy I have on this list because of just the impact he had on those teams. Really brought I want to say grittiness. He is the dude who reminds me most of a 90s Knicks player. And greatly enough, he did play for the Knicks later in his career, but he starts his career in New Jersey, goes to multiple NBA Finals games, makes an All-Star game in the 03-04 season, averaging 17 and 10, 9.5, 17 and 9.5. Kenyon Martin, 10 seasons in the decade, 13.9 points per game, 7 rebounds, true shooting percentage of 51%. Defensive win share at 31.8, which is the highest of any guy in his group. 41.8 for win share total. Value of replacement a little bit higher than David West. That really is what edged him out. The finals appearances also really helped. Kenyon Martin, honestly, the beginning of that stretch 4-5, who you don't necessarily need him to score a ton of points, but he was able to play really good defense. Something that I think gets kind of overlooked when we talk about Kenyon Martin. People remember him more, I think, for being a hard, enforcer type player. But he was a great player when he's playing for the Nuggets, and he's on that Nuggets team that goes to the Western Conference Finals and faced off against the Lakers that year. So I really like Kenyon Martin. I have him as the last guy in this group of players at 53. Tomorrow we're going to do 52 through 36, talk about a couple more Hall of Famers before we can get you to that top 20 coming on Friday. So be looking out for that. That's going to do it for this podcast. There's 4 other podcasts up tonight. You're going to want to go check out all of those when they come out. Doing a lot of TV stuff, breaking down some sports, a bunch of really cool stuff for you. So check it out. I will talk to you guys tomorrow.